Sure, inshallah. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. So this is a really, really important topic, and a very important question about how do we, strengthen the bond within our marriages from the perspective of the Quran and Sunnah. I think that there are many answers to this question, but just a few that I want to focus on. One is that if we look at the Quran and we look at what Allah Subhanahu wa Taala said, how Allah Subhanahu wa Taala describes the relationship of the husband and the wife in the Quran. One really beautiful example of this is in Surah Ar-Rum, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ أَنْ خَلَقَ لَكُم مِّنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ أَزْوَاجًا لِتَسْكُنُوا إِلَيْهَا. That from among his signs is that he created from you, for you, spouses. So these spouses were taken from وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ أَنْ خَلَقَ لَكُم مِّنْ أَنفُسِكُم, so that it is from your own selves that your spouse is created. So we see here that there is a like nature in terms of our spouses, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not putting two people, is not putting men and women together as if they're, different species. But, men and women are from like, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created your spouse from yourself, from min anfusikum, from yourselves, from your soul. And then he says, لِتَسْكُنُوا إِلَيْهَا, in order for you to find sukoon with your spouse, in order for you to find sukoon there. Now, what is sukoon? Sukoon is tranquility, right? And then Allah goes on to say, وَجَعَلَ بَيْنَكُمْ مَوَدَّةً وَرَحْمَةً, and he put between you love and mercy. And so I think one really comprehensive answer to this question of how do we strengthen the bond through the lens of the Quran and the Sunnah, the answer here is that first of all, we have to look at this relationship as a sign of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We have to find Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala within the relationship. Now, what does that mean? Well, practically it means having taqwa, having fear and consciousness of Allah within the relationship. So in the way that we treat one another, in what we do, and then how we view kind of our expectations should be within the framework of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and seeing and having that God consciousness. One thing that you'll notice is that when you read the Quran and you see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for example, in Surah Al-Baqarah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about many verses in a row. In Surah Al-Baqarah, there are many verses about, for example, the rules of divorce in the section of that surah. And then you'll find that in between the discussion about the rules of divorce, you'll find verses talking about taqwa, talking about God consciousness, talking about fear of Allah, seeing Allah, knowing Allah. And I think this is one of the problems, is that sometimes when it comes to our marriages and our divorces, we forget to see Allah there. We take Allah out of the picture. We take consciousness of Allah. We take taqwa out of the picture in the way that we treat one another, either in marriage or in divorce. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is reminding us to always have that consciousness, throughout the relationship, whether it's while the relationship is going on, or at the end of the relationship if there was a divorce. So it's very important for us, and I think that the main thing here is seeing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, having taqwa, and remembering Allah within the relationship, and even if the relationship does not work out.
Jazakallah khair. Next question is, how do you suggest that couples build on their relationship in terms of developing a deeper connection with each other? And how is respect very important in the relationship?
Well, that's an interesting question. Actually, I have a chapter in my book, Reclaim Your Heart, about this concept, where I take some research that was done from a therapist who talks about. There's this book that was written called Love and Respect, and the author is his name is Egerich, and that's spelled Eggrich. And in my book, Reclaim Your Heart, I take what he says about respect and love within a marriage, and then I look at what the Quran and the Sunnah say, and I kind of try to see like where the parallels are. One thing that is very interesting when it comes to talking about respect and talking about love is that, this psychologist or this therapist, he talks about something that sometimes happens within marriages, and he refers to this sort of cycle of argumentation, or this cycle of conflict that sometimes couples get stuck in. And he calls this cycle the crazy cycle. And he explains what this is. And what he explains is that what happens is that women, he says, by and large, women's is most essential need, and this isn't to say that they don't need anything else, but that this is the most essential need by and large for a woman, is to feel love, is to feel loved. And then he says that the most essential need for a man, even more than to feel loved, is to feel respected. Now, again, as a footnote here, this doesn't mean that women don't want respect or that men don't want love. But what he's talking about here is most essential need. So one of the ways he ascertains this is that he asks, if you were to ask an individual, if you had to choose between these two options, which one would you choose? The first option is that nobody respected you, but everyone loved you. Okay. Nobody respected you, but you had love. Or would you choose that nobody loved you, but you had respect? So it's kind of like these very difficult choices, this very difficult question. But what he finds is, and nobody wants to choose, right? No one wants to just choose love or respect. We want both, obviously. But the point that he's making is that for a woman, the most important thing is love, is to feel loved, even more than respect, even more. And again, women obviously want both love and respect, but that love usually is even more of an essential need. But with men, it's different. And this is what he explains, that for a man, the most important thing to him, even more than to be loved, is to be respected and to feel that he is respected by his wife. So what he explains is that sometimes within a marriage, that couples get stuck in this cycle of conflict called the crazy cycle. And what happens is that sometimes, for example, maybe a conflict will happen and the woman feels maybe something that the husband does hurts the woman. It hurts her feelings, it makes her feel upset. And as a result, she feels that he is being unloving. So because she feels unloved, now this is an essential need that she has, right? So because she feels unloved in that moment, she may respond out of hurt with disrespect, right? So for example, the husband does something that is hurtful to the woman, to the wife. And so because the wife is hurt, she'll snap back with disrespect. It's kind of like a defensive sort of response to feeling unloved. Now, what happens is now the man is being deprived of his most essential need, which is respect. So now, because she was deprived of love in that incident, in that moment, she responds by depriving the man of what he needs most, which is respect. So now what's happened is they're both being deprived of their most essential need: love for the woman and respect for the man. So now what happens? What's the result? Well, when a man feels disrespected, how does he respond? Well, what do you think? Does he respond by being more loving or the opposite? Well, he responds by being more unloving. So because he feels disrespected, he's going to be even more harsh, most likely, and he's going to be even more cold. So now she feels even more unloved. So how does she respond? With more disrespect. So you see, it becomes a cycle. It becomes a crazy cycle that many couples get stuck in. And so what they talk about is that this is, a lot of couples are stuck in this cycle and don't know how to break out of it because everybody is responding to the other. When the woman feels unloved, she deprives the man of respect, and when the man feels disrespected, he deprives the woman of love. And then what that does is just, it's perpetuating. It's a self-perpetuating, very toxic and destructive cycle. So then, this therapist talks about, well, how do we break out of this cycle? What's the solution to this cycle? And he talks about something very interesting. On the one hand, he advises men to show unconditional love. Now, why is this so important? Because if a man, no matter how upset he is in that moment or how disrespected he feels in that moment, if in that moment he can continue to show love, it breaks the cycle. Because then once he continues to show love, she will then respond with respect. So that's one way to break out of the cycle. Another way to break out of the cycle is unconditional respect. What does that look like? And this is something interesting for women because oftentimes women, we think more in terms of love. So a woman is very familiar with the concept of unconditional love. It's something we're kind of very comfortable with. It comes very natural. We have this maternal nature where we're very used to loving unconditionally. We love our children unconditionally, and we are very good at loving our spouses unconditionally. But there's something that women aren't as good at, and that is unconditional respect. Women aren't as good at showing respect as they are at showing love. And that becomes a problem for men because men need to be shown respect, and men need, no matter how much that wife loves her husband, it isn't enough for a man if he doesn't feel respected. And one of the ways that this happens, oftentimes you see the manifestation of this is like, for example, I'll just give you an example. Say there's a husband and a wife, right? And the wife loves her husband, right? She loves him so much that she's always mothering him. What does that look like? Well, to him, he feels like she's treating him like a child. She's telling him what to do, how to do it, always giving him instructions, always maybe criticizing. Now, in her mind, that's how she's showing love, right? She's mothering him out of love. So she may love him to bits, but the way she's treating him isn't respectful. And so a man, and it becomes like this issue because the woman's like, what's your problem? I'm only doing it out of love. But she doesn't understand that his language, his essential language is respect. And that he needs respect. He needs that even more than he needs love. And the same thing with women is that we need love. And so a man may be treating a woman, maybe he may be treating a woman with respect, may or may not. But if he's not treating her with love, she's not having that essential need fulfilled. So it's about this cycle of conflict that couples get stuck in, and then how to break out of that with unconditional love and unconditional respect. What does unconditional respect look like? Well, it looks like this. No matter how hurt a woman feels, she continues to show respect. Even in those moments where she's hurt. And that's not easy to do, especially I think for women, because one of our defensive reactions when we're hurt is to sort of have an attitude, you know what I'm saying? And like to kind of put an armor on and maybe be a bit disrespectful. But if we can kind of change that and instead always show respect, regardless of how hurt one is, then that will actually allow you to break out of that cycle. So, this is kind of the perspective that I discuss in the book, in the chapter of Reclaim Your Heart. But then I also look at it from the advice of the Prophet ﷺ. What did the Prophet ﷺ say about this? And what does Allah and His Messenger say? And I found two very interesting points. One is that when the Prophet ﷺ was speaking to women, by and large, he emphasized respect. And that's very interesting because, again, it goes back to man's essential need. He emphasizes respect. And when he is speaking to men and when he is giving advice to men, by and large, he's emphasizing love and gentleness. So, subhanAllah, you see that within the advice of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam.
Jazak. Next, I'm going to ask you about how do you suggest couples identify strengths in their relationship and build on them? And then after that, I will be asking you about how to identify the weaknesses in the relationship and how to, kind of stay away from those.
Right, right. Okay. I think that one of the most important things in identifying strengths in a relationship is changing our lens, right? Changing the way we look at things. So there are two ways to look at the world, right? We can, how many of you have heard of this phrase, glasses half empty versus half full, right? This cliche is something that, most of us have heard of, that you can take a cup, right? And you can say, okay, this cup right now, oh man, it's half empty, right? I can look at that and I can focus on the fact that it's half empty and I'm missing half of my drink. Or I can look at the same cup, right? And I can say, actually, it's half full. I still have half left, right? And those are two different ways, two different paradigms, two different ways to look at the same thing, which is this cup, right? So it's the same thing with our life. We can look at our life as half full, or we can look at what's half empty in our life. I use this example in my classes, and I think it's very illustrative where, there's this meme and it has a picture of two boys. One boy is holding one slice of cake. So he's really, really happy. You see him really smiling big. And then just below him is another boy holding an entire cake with one slice missing. So he's sad. Okay. So when you compare these two boys, you see that, well, number one, who has more cake? Well, the answer is the one who's sad actually has more cake, right? But why is he sad? And the answer is because he's focused on what's missing. He's focused on what's missing in what he has, whereas the one on the top is focused on what he actually has rather than what's missing in his life. So if we look at the world in this way, and then specifically if we look at our relationship in this way, if we change our lens to being a half full lens, like the lens with which we see the world is one where we're looking at what we have instead of what we don't have, or what's missing, or what's going wrong in our lives. So it's really about changing our entire paradigm. Okay. So when we change our lens, we will start to be able more to pick up on the strengths in our relationship. We can't pick up on the strengths if our entire focus is just on, oh, that went wrong, that needs to change, that needs to be fixed, that needs to be solved. If our entire focus is on problems and on what needs to be fixed and what needs to be solved, we won't even be able to recognize the strengths because our lens is very half empty type of lens. So we have to first change the lens. And then once we do that, we'll be more able to recognize the strengths in a relationship, to recognize, this is something I'm very grateful for in my husband or in my wife. This is something I really love about our relationship. But it really has to do with changing the lens to focus on our blessings rather than focusing on what we don't like or what's missing in our relationship and in our life. So once you kind of change the lens, you'll start to see the things that you like, the things that are the strengths in your relationship. Now, how do you capitalize on that? How do you then build on that? The answer is actually quite simple, and that is to show appreciation. There's a principle that we learn in the Quran. وَإِذْ تَأَذَّنَ رَبُّكُمْ لَإِن شَكَرْتُمْ لَأَزِيدَنَّكُمْ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that if you are thankful, He will increase. So He says, if you are, وَإِذْ تَأَذَّنَ رَبُّكُمْ لَإِن شَكَرْتُمْ لَأَزِيدَنَّكُم. If you are thankful, I will increase you. So you see this divine principle that anytime you're thankful for something, anytime you are grateful for something, you get more of that blessing. And so this is one of the best ways to capitalize on a strength in your relationship, is to show gratitude for it, is to show thankfulness for it. If there's a behavior that your spouse exhibits, one of the best ways to actually keep that behavior and to increase that behavior is to show gratitude for that behavior, to show appreciation for that behavior. Same thing with your child. If you see something that you like in your family member, whether it's your spouse or your child, and you show that person that you really appreciate it. I really, really appreciated that you did this for me last night, or I really appreciate this quality about you. I really, really, I'm grateful for you and for this in our relationship. When you do that, you motivate the other person to actually want to do even more, right? And when you do the opposite, when you show ingratitude, and when you show a lack of appreciation, you actually demotivate that person to do more. You see, people are not motivated by criticism, they're more motivated by appreciation. So if you want to strengthen or build or capitalize on a strength in your relationship or in another person, show appreciation for it, and it will increase. And with regards to the second part of that question about weaknesses, well, what happens if if you do have a problem in your relationship? Should we just ignore it, pretend it's not there, and it'll just go away? Well, the answer is no. I don't advise people to ignore problems because that's a little bit like putting a Band-Aid on a gunshot wound. It doesn't make it go away. And in fact, it just grows and it becomes infected over time. So it's important that we do show gratitude for what's going right, but that we also address the problems that are going wrong. And it's very, very important that we don't just pretend that everything's okay and think that it's going to be okay. Some people, they think if they deny a problem, it'll go away. That's not how it works. Denying that you have a gunshot wound and covering it up isn't going to make it go away, and it will only get worse. And so it is important that we do address the problems that we have in our relationships, but we address them in the right way. We address them through the correct channels. And I'll just briefly talk about that. I'll tell you what the incorrect channel is, and that is just sort of gossiping to various people about the problem. That's not going to help the problem, and it can actually just make it worse. I'll tell you some of the ways that can make it worse. Number one, if you share your problem with someone who doesn't give very good advice, they may advise you in a way that is actually quite toxic and not give you very good advice. Number two is that it can get back to the individual who you're having the conflict with and actually make it worse. It can spread in that way. It can grow arms and legs. One other issue is that even when the couple themselves resolve the problem, but if it's spread outside, it can kind of come back and maybe just haunt them. So just for the sake of gossiping, that's not useful. Now, when is it useful to share it with another person? Well, the answer is when you're getting help, when you're seeking help. And I advise people to do that. I advise people to go to counseling. I advise people to seek help from a trusted individual who can mediate, who can counsel, who can help. And in that case, it's not backbiting. In fact, we are supposed to try to seek help when we are having problems in our relationships. Just like if we have a health problem, you have a disease or you have anything wrong with your body, we're told to go to a doctor, right? In the same way, when we have a problem within our relationships, we should go to a doctor or a counselor, a mediator, or someone that can help us, and that is actually something that we'll be rewarded for, because we're trying to fix it. We're not going there, just to make our spouse look bad, but we're actually trying to fix the problem. So that's something that we have to do as part of our worship, and it's something that can be very beneficial. So we don't ignore our problems. We don't pretend that they're not there and expect them to go away, but we also make sure that we're going to the right sources for help, and that we're going to the people who can really give us good advice and who can actually aid in working out that problem rather than possibly making it worse.
Jazakallah. Next focus is on oftentimes when people are married for a period of time, couples start taking each other for granted. So how do you suggest that they stay away from that, and how to keep the marriage alive?
Great question. So one of the ways to not start to take one another for granted is really going back to that gratitude type of mindset, that half full mindset. But one thing you have to realize is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran that mankind can by nature be very ungrateful, right? That Allah says kafura, and the meaning of kafura isn't just to disbelieve, but to actually be ungrateful. So mankind has a tendency towards ingratitude. This is a tendency we have to fight against. We have to actively fight against this tendency to take things for granted. I mean, think of all that we take for granted from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah gives us oxygen. We're breathing easily every single day. We don't even recognize that we're breathing until when? Until we can't breathe, right? You don't even notice that you're breathing until maybe you're underwater, or maybe, God forbid, you have a problem with your lungs. Then all of a sudden we recognize that we were breathing, only when it's taken away or threatened. But it's like whenever we have a gift or we have a blessing, we have this tendency to just take it for granted. We don't maybe notice the blessing of our hearing or of our sight until when? Until it is threatened, until all of a sudden you can't see, or you can't hear, or it's starting to become threatened in some way. Then we recognize that this was a blessing that we had. Similarly, our health. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us health. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows us to wake up in the morning and not be in pain, right? The fact that we're not in pain is a huge blessing. There are people who live with chronic pain, chronic, all the time they're in pain. And they would give anything to just have one day without pain. And these people will take drugs, they'll do whatever they can to just have no pain. And this is something that many of us live with all the time. We're pain-free. But do we recognize these things? So first is that we have to see and realize that mankind, that humans have this tendency and this weakness towards ingratitude, and we have to actively fight against that. And so similarly, the same way we take Allah for granted and we take the blessings of Allah for granted, we do it to people too. We do it to our wife, we do it to our husband, we do it to our kids, we do it to our parents all the time. I mean, parents are very often taken for granted. I mean, I think one of the most people that are taken for granted is parents. We do it to our friends. We just have this tendency. So what we have to do is we have to fight against that tendency, that human weakness, by actively practicing gratitude. Now, what does that look like? Well, studies have shown that when people keep a gratitude journal, and what this means is that every day they write down 3 to 5 things that they're grateful for. That's it. Just write down 3 to 5 things every day that you're grateful for. And what these studies found is that when people do that, it actually is so powerful that it can even treat depression. Just the practice of keeping this gratitude journal. Now, what if we did that with our relationship? What if every day we just noted down 3 to 5 things that we are grateful for about our spouse, that we appreciate about our spouse, even if it's not something that happened that day, but just any quality, anything they've ever done, but that we focus on it and we pick 3 to 5 things every day. Even if we picked one thing every day, it would have a huge difference. It would make a difference because what that's doing is it's focusing us, our focus, it's making our focus on what good things are in our spouse. Because unfortunately, through life and the stress of life and the sort of, as you said, you get used to someone, you take them for granted, you tend to sort of stop seeing the good things and you hyper focus on the bad. You start to fix it. Oh man, that thing that he does is so annoying, or that thing she does, it's so annoying. But we don't remember all the good that they do because we're just not focused on it, right? We just have this weakness as human beings to not always be grateful. So if we can actively show gratitude by actually writing it down every single day, write down 3 to 5 things, anything at all that you appreciate or you like about your spouse. And I promise you that will improve your relationship. It'll improve how you feel about your spouse. And that's just simply by focusing your heart and your mind on what you like and what you appreciate rather than on the opposite.
Jazakallah. And
Yeah.
then I'm going to do one more thing, then I'll go over to general questions.
Excellent.
As far as this is about how to draw on emotional reserves in times of stress and develop conflict resolution skills.
Okay. Well, I think, one of the most important things that you can do in order to be able to draw on sort of, I guess this is a concept of resilience and thriving, right? When you're faced with challenges, how do you, tap into this reserve, right? It's important that let me, give an example so I can kind of explain this concept. The story of the 3 little pigs? So the story of the 3 little pigs is like, right, you have these 3 pigs, and one of them is like really, really lazy. The second one's like moderately lazy, and the third one is very hardworking. So the really lazy one, he goes and he quickly just makes a house out of like straw or something. Okay, it's very, very weak. And then the second one, who's like moderately lazy, quickly makes a house a little bit stronger but out of twigs, again, very, very weak. But then the third pig, who's more hardworking and is putting in the time, he builds his house out of brick. He takes the time to build the house properly in a strong foundation. So then what happens in the story is that the big bad wolf comes, and the story says that he huffs and he puffs and he completely blows the first house down. Why does he blow the first house down? Because it was weak in its foundation. That pig didn't put in the work to build a strong house. The second one, he huffs and he puffs, and again, he blows that one down because, again, it was weak. It was made out of twigs. But then the third one, when he huffs and he puffs, he can't blow that one down because it had a strong foundation and it was built from brick. The work was done ahead of time in order to make that strong. Now, I use that analogy to talk about spiritual and psychological resilience. How do we build a house that is strong enough to be able to withstand the huffing and the puffing of our lives, our life's challenges? That's the question, right? And not just the challenges that face us individually, but the challenges that face our marriage and our relationships as well. How do we build that strong house so that it doesn't get destroyed when those challenges come our way? And there's a few things that I can use to answer that question. But first and foremost, one of the most important things that we can do to build that resilience and that strong fortress is through the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If we are the type of person who, as a sort of a habit, we are consistent in the remembrance of Allah every day, without fail, regardless of what we're going through. But we are consistent in our salah, consistent in our prayers, consistent in our Quran, consistent in our azkar. If that, what that type of person is doing is that with every prayer, with every time they read the Quran, with every time they do their azkar, morning and evening and before they sleep and throughout their day, every time they remember Allah, they are building a brick into that house. They are adding another brick, another strong foundation to the home itself. And now that becomes something that can withstand any type of storm that later faces that individual or that later faces that family. But it's very essential that it's something that we're building all the time. It's not just, you can't just suddenly build that house as soon as the storm hits, right? It has to be something that you are already building daily as your daily routine. So the remembrance of Allah is essential. Second, in terms of the strength of your relationship and the resilience of your relationship, well, this kind of goes to have to do with emotional bank accounts. How much are we doing for the other person, and the more that we are investing in the relationship and investing in the other person, the more we're building a strong foundation, so that if the relationship does go through challenges, it still has that strength, that strong sort of fortress that it can withstand that storm. So again, I think the answer really has to do with not just how are we behaving when the storm hits. It's not really about how we're going to be when the challenge is facing us, but really the question is, how are we outside of the storm? What are we doing in our everyday life to build that strong foundation and that strong fortress around ourselves and around our relationships? And again, first and foremost, it has to be based in the remembrance of Allah, because that is what gives our house a strong foundation. And that's what's going to protect us and allow us not to be destroyed when we face these challenges of life.
Jazakallah khair.
And,
next, I think in the interest of time, I will go to the general questions that are coming in, since we have quite a few. The first question is, just one second. Go down. This is about is it unreasonable for a husband to ask his wife, or vice versa, not to have communication or interaction with non-mahrams in a normal acquaintance, like in a work acquaintance or in a everyday acquaintance?
Okay. Well, I mean, again, this comes down to the sort of rules that the boundaries that Allah and His Messenger have given us, and I think that it really has to do with what is an appropriate way of interacting with the opposite gender. We have to always have boundaries, right? It's one thing to interact with a non-mahram in a professional setting, in a very respectful, modest way. It's another thing to be flirtatious or to be overly friendly, or to believe that, oh, you know what, we're just friends. These are different types of ways of interacting. And it's very important that we're clear on what is appropriate and what is not appropriate, because the boundaries that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have given us are for our own protection. So again, the question really has to do with, are we interacting in a way that is professional and modest and necessary, or are we interacting in a way that is maybe unnecessary and maybe flirtatious, and kind of crossing those boundaries that are set by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Messenger?
So I think the question is about in normal interactions, but do they have to be with the permission of the husband, or
I can't answer that question without, I mean, I can't answer that question with such a general question without specifics. It could be it could be their boss at work and the husband is saying, don't talk to your boss. Or it could be, it could be maybe a coworker where it's not necessary to be chit chatting. So it's a very general question, but again, you can't answer the question unless you know the specifics of the case. But what we do know is that there are rules that Allah and His Messenger have given us, and we need to stick to those rules, for our own protection. Again, it's not to say we can never communicate with the opposite gender, but again, it goes back to what is the way of communication? What is it something that's necessary, unnecessary, and then what is the demeanor of that communication?
Okay, Jazakallah. And the
But yeah.
next is a little long. I'm going to read it out from here. This is for families that have lived in the United States for a few decades. Men and women both have become comfortable with the concept of freedom for themselves and certain responsibilities that seem religious and cultural, such as men expecting women to shoulder financial burden, and women expecting to relieve themselves of cultural baggage that men burden them with. Basically, both men and women tend to leverage religious and cultural values to their advantage without consideration of limitation, viewpoint, health issues of the other partner. What is your thought about this?
Okay, that's a great question. I think there's two issues here. One issue is what is actually the letter of the law in the Sharia? Yeah, that's one question. That's one issue. And we can talk about that, especially if you're speaking to someone who is really qualified in fiqh or a sheikh or sheikha. You can get the rules for that. For example, it is not the responsibility of the wife to shoulder the financial the financial burden, but that is the responsibility of men, as indicated in the Quran. So we can talk about the fiqh of it, right? We can talk about the rules. But then there's another issue here, and that is that when a relationship starts to become all about my rights and this is what I deserve, that's actually not a good place to be. Because for a relationship to be healthy, it should be that both parties are interested in giving, not interested in just taking. And so I think that once a relationship has come to a place where it's a lot of just me and give me and it's all about my right, I think that there's a deeper problem there, and that deeper problem should be addressed, because relationship isn't supposed to be all about, am I getting my rights? Yes, you should not allow anyone to mistreat you or be unjust to you. Absolutely. But when the focus becomes just demanding your rights, rather than sort of a cooperative give and take, then I think there may be a deeper problem that should be resolved in that relationship, because that hopefully that shouldn't be the focus if each party is giving and more focused on what they're giving rather than on what they're getting.
Jazakallah. And the next question is about a question we've addressed previously about building a strong foundation for the relationship to withstand the storm. What if only one spouse is working towards building the foundation and strengthening the marriage? I have seen it around women work 10 times harder to work on the relationship than men. Is that fair?
That's a tough one. I think that there's something to be said about that. I think that maybe women are more focused on their relationships, and they sometimes see that there's a problem a lot sooner, a lot earlier in the process than men. I think sometimes men are like, everything's fine when things are not fine. I think sometimes that's a little bit of a defense mechanism, denying the issue. I think in cases like that, it would be beneficial to seek help, to maybe get the advice of a trusted either family member or a counselor. But maybe basically involve someone else that you trust and someone who's qualified to get involved and to try to help resolve the issues, and maybe make the husband in this case understand what the perspective of the wife is in terms of her concerns.
Jazakallah khair. And how do you suggest a couple can avoid burnout in marriage?
I think it really goes back to gratitude. I think that when you focus on the things that you like in your marriage, the things that you like in your spouse, it will keep that sort of flame burning, because you're like, wow, yeah, I really like this. I mean, I really appreciate this. Wow, like I don't know what I would do without having this in my life. But when you stop sort of focusing on these good things, that flame can really burn out fast, because every time you see something bad, it's sort of like it burns you out, and then you see something else, it burns you out, and you're not really doing anything to feed that flame. You're not doing anything to keep that flame there, because you're not really focusing on any of the good things. So I think, again, going back to appreciation and gratitude, and not just feeling that appreciation and gratitude, this is also very important, is expressing it. We have to understand the importance, and I think this is maybe more of a challenge sometimes with men, but the expression of emotion is also essential in a relationship. And by the way, these are not my words. This is even the advice of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because he said, for example, in one hadith, he said that if you love your brother, or when you love your brother, tell him that you love him, right? So he's advising us to be expressive about our emotion and not just keeping it inside. So expression of love is very, very important. Expression of appreciation is very important. See, one can say, yeah, I really, really appreciate my husband, or I really, really appreciate my wife, but I never express it. I never tell them how much I appreciate them. Well, then that's not really as beneficial, because you're not letting them know. So that's also very, very important. Feeling that appreciation, noticing the good, being grateful for the good, but also expressing that appreciation is essential to keep that flame and keep from the burnout.
Jazakallah. And then next question that is posed is about money. Oftentimes in relationships, there are difficulties and arguments about money. And if the husband and wife both are earning, according to the Sunnah, what is the right of the husband on the wife's money and the wife on the husband's money?
Mm-hmm. Well, according to the Islamic law, the husband has no right over the wife's money, and that's something that is confirmed. There's no disagreement about that. If the woman makes money, that money is her own money, and he doesn't have a right on that money. And if he does, take any of that money, it would be sinful upon him. That would be dhulm. That would be an act of injustice if he were to take from her money, without her permission, or try to in any way control that money, because that is her money, and he doesn't have a right over it. Now, in terms of the money that he makes, yes, as we know, one of his responsibilities as a man is to financially support the family. Now, that includes the children as well as the wife. Now, that doesn't mean that he is required to buy her a Mercedes. It doesn't mean he's required to buy her, Versace, whatever. Like it's not about specific level necessarily that's required, but that he is required to maintain her and the family with his money. So she has a right over his money to a certain degree, for her needs, etc., and for her children's needs. However, she doesn't have a right to demand certain above and beyond things, that he can give or that he wants to spend. So there is that, definitely. There is that right that the wife has over his money, but that's for maintenance, has to be taken care of, obviously in a reasonable way, compared to, in reference to what he has. She has a right to that. Her children have a right to that. They shouldn't be, staying in a homeless shelter if he has the money to get a home for them. You know what I'm saying? Extreme example, but you get my point. But at the same time, she can't she doesn't have a right that he buys her a specific kind of car, for example. And then in terms of her money, again, that's her money, and he doesn't have a right to that.
Jazakallah. Next question is, if your spouse places priority on the children versus the spouse, how do you address that?
Well, that's a really, really important question that I like to focus on a lot when I talk about relationships. I think this is actually one of the hidden sort of poisons within our relationships right now that I'm observing. And that is exactly what this person is asking. That what happens is that in a lot of relationships, the focal point becomes the children. The children get put at the center, and then the parent or parents do tawaf around those children, right? They revolve their lives around those children, and they actually forget or put to the side their own marital relationships. That is actually unjust. And it is imbalanced, and you will never be able to have, and listen carefully to this, you will never be able to have a solid and stable family structure if it is the children who are at the center, or if it is the children that are the foundation. That family structure will not be strong. The only way to have a strong family structure is to put the marriage as the foundation. And that's very, very key. Anytime the marriage is strong, anytime the spouses invest in one another and in their relationship with one another, then the entire family will be strong. Then the children will be secure. But it can never happen if the marriage is not strong. That's the most essential part of that foundation, is to invest in the marriage, invest in your spouse, invest in your relationship. And if you do that, then the entire family structure will be strong, and the children will become secure. The children will be secure when the marriage is strong. The children will be secure when the marital foundation is solid. But if it is not, then no matter what, it won't be secure. So that's actually one of the biggest mistakes that we make, is that we don't invest in our marriage, and instead it's all about the children. It's all about, our son or our daughter, and we completely stop focusing on the spouse or on the marriage. That is actually unjust. Remember that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not approve of injustice. If you are taking away the rights of your spouse because you're so hyper focused on the child, that is zulm, that is injustice. You hear about cases, for example, where the mother maybe is sleeping by the child and the husband sleeps alone. That is completely lopsided. That is an injustice. The husband and the wife have a right to have their spouse with them and to have a relationship with them. And so that is an example where there is an imbalance, and that family structure will never be strong.
Jazakallah. Next question is, talking about practicing unconditional love, how do you figure out your spouse's version of unconditional love? We know what unconditional love looks like when talking about our kids or even pets, but adults are different, a bit more complex.
True. And to answer that question, I would direct you to a book called The 5 Love Languages. This is a book that talks about how different people have different languages in which they understand and communicate love. So one of the love languages, for example, is words of affirmation. Words of affirmation means that your love language is that when someone says loving words to you, you feel loved. And maybe the way you communicate love is through words. There's another love language called acts of service, for example. A person who has that love language would feel loved when someone does them a favor, or they themselves show love by doing someone a favor. So for example, you might have a couple where the wife, her love language is words of affirmation, and the husband, his love language is acts of service. She might say to the husband, you know what? Why don't you ever express love to me? And he'll reply and say, but I fixed your car. So it's like they're just speaking different love languages. She's asking for, romantic words or loving words, or words to express the love, and because that may be her love language. And he is showing love by doing acts of service for her, by taking care of something for her, fixing her car, for example, in this scenario. So I would say to look into that. This book talks about how to begin to understand these different love languages, and to be able to make your spouse feel love in a way that they understand, in a language that they can understand and absorb.
Jazakallah. And then another question that came up is the husband allowed to ask the wife not to work out of the house?
So this is actually a matter that really needs to be discussed before the marriage, because the wife has a right to choose who she marries. And if she doesn't want to marry someone who's uncomfortable with his wife, working outside the home, then she has that right. But that's why it's so important that this is actually discussed before the marriage. These are some of the questions that need to be talked about in premarital counseling, in premarital discussions, because the husband may have a preference that, for example, he wants his wife to be at home with the children, to raise the children. Maybe he doesn't want to send his children to daycare, for example. If that's something he wants, he has a right to want that. But if the wife doesn't want that, then they're not going to be on the same page. And so that's very important that these things are discussed prior to the marriage, so that everyone is being fair to the other person.
So I think the question is, I think they're asking about what if they're already in that situation?
What I would advise in that case is to get that mediated. So to go and to talk to someone they trust, who can counsel, mediate between them, try to find a common ground between the two, because it may be a source of conflict. And anytime we have a conflict like that, it's good to go and then try to get someone we trust, either someone qualified as a therapist, or maybe even someone in the family to help us mediate that conflict.
Jazakallah.
Yeah.
I think we're kind of up on time.
Sure.
So I would like to request you to do a dua for everybody who's attending. And
okay.
And who to resolve any seen or unseen conflicts in their life, and to increase the love in their relationships. And Jazakallah for attending the.
Yes, Jazakallah khair. And I also want to, just as a resource, let people know, if you or someone who is in a relationship and they're looking for maybe some help, or they're having some conflict. My husband is actually he works as an Islamic-based marital coach. He does his work, he does it remotely, so people from all over the world. If you are interested, or someone who is interested, he has a website where he does his bookings through, and it's www.qasimrafiq.com, and the spelling is QASIMRAFIQUE.com. So inshallah, if you could write that and you can share it for those, if it's a resource, inshallah, that can help others. I ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it easy on all of us, and rectify any problems that we may have in our relationships, and protect us from the harms of the seen and the unseen, and allow us to enter Jannah together, in a way that is pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to make our spouses and our children the coolness of our eyes. أقول قولي هذا استغفر الله لي ولكم إنه غفور رحيم. سبحانك الله وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. جزاكم الله خيرا. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Jazakallah khairan. And before we dismiss, I would like to remind the next workshop, inshallah, in January, is a fun workshop. It is about baking and decorating your cakes. And our local baker, Jude Gannan, is going to be doing that. And so feel free to put it on the calendar. It's going to be on January 9th, inshallah. And it's going to be from 4 to 5 p.m. Jazakallah, everybody, for attending. And assalamu alaikum.